Yeah, sanctions in themselves are actions that are taken unilaterally or collectively against a nation that is perceived to be violating international law. Um, and back in the day, really before the evolution of international law, it was just a mechanism through which states would intervene in affairs of another state where their actions are perceived to be violating rights of human beings in that environment. And that's because back then states dealt with each other through treaties, mostly trade related treaties. So that means one state could have an economic interest in another state. So if such a state is destabilized, or if the condition or the situation of human rights is so bad in that state, so these states that have interests in this place would then find mechanisms of restraining actions within that territory. So I'll give an example of the time that Turkey, Greece was actually fighting for independence from Turkey. And in that moment, Russia, France, and Britain had to come and put blockades at the coast to stop firearms, which were being, shipped in for Turkey and by Egyptian forces. They had to put these blockades to stop reinforcement of this country through firearms, and to sort of manage the situation with Greece. So in that way, they were not engaging in war. They were not fighting Greece, they were not fighting Turkey, but they were just, using non-violent means of stopping the situation or managing the situation. Of course, over time, as international law has evolved, also the way sanctions are have also evolved. What has not changed is the fact that they are, for the most part, non-militant in nature. So that means it doesn't really require a lot of use of force. It only comes in as a last resort, but most times, most of the sanctions are still, they're non-militant in nature. And now with international law evolving and countries really ratifying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international mechanisms, sanctions have now become part and parcel of international practice. So that means as a state, if you've ratified to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have, one, accepted that human rights are universal. Secondly, you have accepted to be part of a whole international community that should protect the rights of its citizens. Much as states still maintain their sovereignty, that means you're still independent. That sovereignty only works to the extent that rights or freedoms that are being enshrined in these international laws are being protected. And then the rest of the international community has evidence to the fact that, there's peace and democracy, freedoms and respect of human rights in a particular state. So as is now, today, sanctions are beyond, the ones that are imposed by the UN and also in the instruments. They're those that are unilateral in nature. That means a state sanctioning another state for actions that they perceive to be a violation of human rights, freedoms, and democracy. So in the case of, for example, what has just happened in Uganda, this is an example of a unilateral sanction from the US against particular individuals in Uganda. And this particularly targets individuals that, again, they perceive to be violators of human rights and people who are not promoting, principles of democracy and freedoms. And so the way sanctions work now is that they work at levels. There are sanctions against a country, so those could mean, a high-handed approach where perhaps a country has to intervene. For example, what has happened in Iran and other countries. It could also be economic sanctions where your exports are restricted and there are bans that are put that really target your economic relations across the border. But they could also be what we are seeing now, which are, travel restrictions against individuals, and this extends to the immediate family, it extends to their business relations and any other connections they may have with that country. The impact of sanctions in this instance really has an implication on Ugandans abroad only to the extent that the Ugandan is related to the people that are being sanctioned. Because usually how these sanctions work is that If, for example, you're sanctioned as an individual, it affects your immediate family. If they're here, if they want to travel, but it can also affect your immediate family if they're based, for example, in the US. Any other transactions that you may have with a company in the US, or any other, if you have bank accounts there, if you have anything happening on the other side, definitely they will be impacted in that manner. Of course, for us broadly as a country and as citizens, it taints our image, because as a country you'd like to portray yourself as, you know, upholders of rights and democracy and freedoms, but then when a public statement about the sanction is released, like just happened, definitely it paints an image, a bad image about Uganda. We all know Uganda is a destination for tourism, and there are also so many other countries that have business interests in Uganda. What this does is to flag off Uganda as a country whose human rights status is wanting, a country where there is no respect for human rights. So in this case, definitely the image of Uganda, when it's tainted, it affects all of us, because it will have far-reaching implications in terms of if somebody wanted to, for example, if somebody wants to invest in Uganda, they will want to first assess what is the human rights situation in Uganda. Will I be safe in Uganda? Will who I'm sending there be safe in Uganda? So in that way, it really does have an implication on us as a citizenry. But also the other implication is if Uganda, for example, does not change and continues to do the things they're doing as they're doing now, we could have heavier sanctions. It could now be a sanction against the state. And it could also be sanctions from other states as well, for example, from the European Union or other interested international agencies. And ultimately, that is something we do not want, but something that, if it happens, could mean so much in terms of our economic status. It could mean so much in terms of our image, and it could also mean so much in terms of our relationship globally. The government of Uganda needs to consider what happened, first of all, very seriously, and as such, it needs to take steps to ensure that it rights the wrongs, as have been stated in the sanctions. As these sanctions have been issued, there are very clear grounds against which these sanctions have been issued, and they have been very clearly documented. So it is, first of all, in the best interest of the state to have an internal reflection of where we are at in terms of the human rights situation and the issues that have been listed in the sanction, and for them to be able to act where there have been allegations of human rights violations. The government should hold the perpetrators to account. Where there have been issues with restrictive civic space for civil society, the government should be able to take steps to, to expound the civic space and enable, a conducive environment for civil society to operate. And most importantly, by the time an ally of the state takes steps to sanction individuals within a state, that means that our own state systems have failed to hold perpetrators of gross human rights violations accountable. That means our own systems have failed to uphold the very principles of democracy and freedom. So we need to restore public confidence in our systems. We need to have, the state itself needs to take steps to restore our own, trust in the systems that are meant to protect us. They should be seen to be creating a conducive environment for our citizens to enjoy their rights as have been enshrined in the Constitution. Ultimately, the goal here is not for the government to work on its relationship with the US, because this has nothing to do with their relationship. This has more to do with what is happening between the government and its own citizens, because that is the reason the sanctions have been issued. That means if the government is doing what they have to do to protect and promote the rights of citizens, there will be nothing the US will sanction the government about. But as long as that is not being done, ultimately, not just the US, but any other international actors that believe Uganda is not living up to its obligations, international obligations, will also issue sanctions on maybe the state itself or on individuals as well. So the government needs to take urgent steps to address the human rights situation. The government needs to take urgent steps to bring to offer or to promote accountability for crimes that have been committed. And I think that has been the cry of the citizens, that has been the cry of civil society, that has been the cry of the international community. We know that over the past year, whenever violations have happened, different actors have come out to release statements of concern about the situation. But what has remained wanting until this day is the steps that have been taken to fix the situation. Instead of being dismissive, instead of denying that things are happening, instead of politicizing something that we know to be true, I believe the state has to come out and apologize to its citizens. But above all, the state needs to come out and right the wrongs as documented in the sanctions. That way, there will be no reason for Uganda to be in bad light with any country, and also with its own citizens. Uganda as a country, which is composed of the government and its citizens, needs to heavily invest in cultivating a free society where people are free to express themselves, where people feel confident and secure as they go about their normal lives. As is now, the situation is a situation of tension, of insecurity. You do not know whether after what you have said, you are going to be alive. You do not know if on your way home you'll be kidnapped. So people are living on tension and people are insecure. And people do not even trust that if something happens to me, I can go to a state institution for protection. That means that there's a big problem. So we need to restore the citizens' hope and their confidence in the systems that be. We should also be able to create an environment where citizens can go about enjoying their rights and freedoms freely without feeling that they will have to have consequences for every action, or for rightfully criticizing or speaking about things that may not be going right. Ultimately, we know there's some things that are going right, but we know there's so much that is not going right, especially for young people, for women, for vulnerable groups in this country. So the state should invest more in, accountability. The state should invest more in strengthening justice institutions so that they can be able to be a place where people go to enforce rights. They can be able to be places where people go for protection when their rights are violated.